President Joe Biden signed Democrats' latest $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. It left out that $15 minimum wage provision, but it does provide $1,400 checks to Americans making under $75,000 a year, and it also extends unemployment benefits, among other things.
That's right. Host of Economic Update and professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and co-founder of Democracy at Work, Richard Wolff. He joins us now to discuss his thoughts on the latest stimulus bill. Good to see you, Professor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Give us your thoughts generally on the bill. Some progressives, they have hailed it as one of the most progressive pieces of legislation ever. I mean, in general, it seems to be somewhere in the middle, but large amounts of money are going to the bottom 20% of Americans. Do you think it will have done what it should have done? In general, how do you see the prospects of economic recovery on the horizon?
Well, given how I'm going to answer, let me start by saying the bar is very low these days, and
yes,
this is certainly better than what we've seen for quite a few years. I don't want to take away from that or deny it. It provides some relief, and it should be called a relief bill. What really irks me is the comments from some of the Democratic leaders. The other day, a statement from Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who should know better. This notion that it is transformative, that it's going to eradicate poverty. This is nutty. This is so far over the border that, it's in another planet. This is not going to do that. In order to do that, you have to face what none of them are willing to face, which is that we have been redistributing wealth and income upward for over 40 years. And we have an economy that works like that. And that's why so many people are poor. That's why so many of our institutions are in trouble. That's why we have fires in California, no electricity in Texas, a response to COVID-19 that is embarrassing on the world stage, and a rate of minimum wage of $7.25 an hour at the federal level, which is an embarrassment for the rest of the industrial advanced world because it's one of the lowest there is. $15, they're already there. And if you give people $15 an hour, you're not ending poverty. You're just ratcheting it up a little bit. And they didn't even do that. So for me, this is the kind of help. You're grateful for it, but boy, is this less than what we need. We have, last point, we have the worst crisis in at least a century. A Great Depression, almost as bad as the one in the 1930s, and a great public health disaster, as bad as the one in 1918. But what we've never had before is the two of them together at the same time, each one worsening the other. To that, you need a massive structural response, and that bill has not yet been drafted.
Yeah. I talked to John Nichols last week. He described this as another sort of managerial bill. And again, not to downplay that this is going to help a lot of people, and that's really important. But it seems hard to me to make the case that it's transformative when almost all of its provisions expire in a year. So we're transforming just for a year, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Yeah, you could have done more. You could have raised the minimum wage. It would have lifted 30, 40 million people because of the number of people whose wage, while above the minimum, is pegged to the minimum and will go up when the minimum is in fact raised. You could have done that. You might then have built in the expectations that when we will have a level of wages, it still doesn't overcome the division of wealth and income in this country, therefore the political divisiveness that everybody whines about. I mean, you're not dealing with those problems. You know what it reminds me of? Those comments we heard a few weeks ago or months ago that what the Biden administration is trying to do is get us back to pre-Trump normal. And that is a terrible conceptual error because it was that kind of economy before Trump that delivered us to Trump and him to us. And if that's what we reproduce now, we can't be surprised if it reproduces the next Trump.
Yeah, and sir, what do you make of it? I mean, Joe Biden and many of his staff are coming out saying that this is FDR, LBJ style legislation. What's your assessment of that?
I think it's an insult to FDR. And there were problems with FDR. But let's remember, FDR did an extraordinary structural thing. Many of them. Number one, he created the Social Security system, pressure from below. But that wasn't a temporary measure. Kristen's quite right. That was a measure that said, if you're 65 years of age and you've given a lifetime of labor, we're going to give you a pension check every month for as long as you live. Every family in America could then count on this. Young people would know that they wouldn't have to carry alone the burden of the elderly who don't work anymore, etc. Then the unemployment compensation system likewise had never existed before. And here's the really big one that I find an embarrassment to hear Biden talk this way. Roosevelt created a federal jobs program. He went on the radio and he said, if the private capitalist sector cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who ask only that they have a job, I, as president, will do so. And between 1934 and 41, he created and filled 15 million jobs. People who had a job, who had an income, who could maintain their rent or their mortgage payments, who could think about themselves as productive citizens. We now have, by estimates, roughly 20 million at least unemployed people, not even counting those that have left the labor force. Where is the Rooseveltian program to give them the federal jobs that we certainly need, that they certainly need? And if you were interested in really changing things, you would have had this at least debated. They didn't even debate it. They didn't even make the effort for that they put in limply for the $15 minimum wage. So comparing it to FDR does a disservice to one of the few who were willing to think structurally in the history of the Democratic Party.
And Professor, finally, what is your expectation for the economy this year, and what are the metrics that you're going to be paying attention to?
Well, I expect more hype. We are going to come back, especially if these vaccines hold. We are going to come back from the disaster of 2020, and that will give a kind of boost, maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 7% growth. I've already seen people gloat that this will be more than the Chinese, who conservatively estimate 6% for the year ahead. And maybe the United States will do better. But that is not going to erase the last 25 years in which the average Chinese rate of growth each year was 3 times what it was here in the United States. And even that is a push. And part of the reason is that you cut back at the last minute. You X those 8 million people out who might have gotten a check, but suddenly people on the Hill were considering, gee, who needs it? I was struck that in December of 2017, when that tax cut, that historic tax cut was handed out, none of these men and women seemed to be concerned that you might be helping with a tax cut a business that didn't need it, the way we didn't want to give people a check for $1,400. Well, billions were involved there in a way that they weren't here, and yet the need conversation didn't happen. An irony. If you cut back and that ends up making the difference, they will be very sorry that they held back at a time when they're so desperately in need of believing their economy is coming back.
Yeah.
Such a great point. No one was saying, hey, does Amazon really need this additional tax cut? Professor, it's always great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Coming up, West Virginia Governor Jim Justice. He's going to talk about that state's successful vaccine rollout when Rising returns.